So the rematch between Lewis Crocker and Paddy ended in controversy, with the decision leaving fans divided. It was a tactical battle, with Crocker making smart adjustments that caused two knockdowns. But many thought Paddy did enough to win. So we'll break down those changes, unpack the drama, and ask the big question: what's next for both fighters? So let's jump into how controversial was the decision. So it's important to acknowledge the following. Lewis Crocker scored two knockdowns. Why is that relevant? Well, a knockdown is typically a 10-8 round. So if you win a round, it's 10-9, and if you score a knockdown, then you would typically have a 10-8. That means if you score two knockdowns in two separate rounds, effectively you have won 4 rounds. Additional to this, if you look at the fight from what I observed, most of the rounds were close. There was tiny margins. For example, did you like the movement and counterpunching of Lewis Crocker, or did you like the higher work rate and aggression from Paddy? Paddy clearly looked good in parts, especially when he shortened up his punches. And Paddy showed that he could overcome adversity, and that's important. And he also showed a comfortability in taking the center of the ring. Despite this, though, I'm not sure if controversial decision is the right words considering the context. However, I can totally understand Paddy and his team's frustration. He would feel that he was the superior fighter, and particularly the type of domination he had in the first fight. You can imagine that you would just be frustrated with this outcome. And I think that there's some questions to ponder here. So first of all, boxing is subjective as opposed to objective. So the question would be, did you agree with the judges' scorecards? How did you see it? And is it objective or is it subjective? And I think a lot of this would come down to this question: which style did you personally value more? Did you like the movement and the counters of Lewis Crocker, or did you like the pressure and the slightly more volume of Paddy? And considering what's happened, should there be another fight? So to me, this fight showed the importance of strategy, and the person that made the most effective strategical adjustment was clearly Lewis Crocker. Let's briefly explain historically why strategy is important. Now, when Evander Holyfield, the great Evander Holyfield, fought Riddick Bowe in the first fight, he lost a decision in a tremendous, tremendous war. But in the rematch, he made some strategical adjustments. More jabs, more movement, and instead of focusing on being inside, he combined some outside fighting or more outside fighting with inside fighting. He also had different combinations. Instead of doubling up his left hook, he would use the short left hook to set up the straight right. And this was important in changing the outcome. So Evander's victory in the rematch over Riddick Bowe was about a change of strategy. Also, another reference point is David Haye versus Valuev. David Haye, quite cleverly in the build up to the fight, told Valuev that he was going to go for the knockout. So if you took David Haye at his word, you would prepare for an aggressive fighter. And it made sense because David Haye's a power puncher. But David Haye came into the ring, he utilized movement, utilized feints, and he adopted the hit and not get hit philosophy. And it was very effective because Valuev struggled to get into punching range. Again, this fight was predicated by the effective strategy of David Haye. Of course, there's loads of other examples. Another one that comes to mind is the Sugar Ray Leonard-Roberto Duran rematch, where again, Sugar Ray Leonard made those adjustments. So when we speak about Lewis Crocker, in the first fight, he neglected the jab. There wasn't enough feints. And even though he was sometimes moving his head, he was effectively a stationary target. But then in the rematch, he introduced the jab. he brought the jab into play. He introduced the feints, and the way he was pouring with the jab. When you do this with the jab, if you're feinting to set up either a hard jab or a left hook, but also you're blurring an opponent's vision. Additional to this, he had so much foot movement. This meant that in the first fight, the target was right in front of Paddy, but this time Paddy had to find the target. And when he found the target, he then had to contend with the lethal counterpunches. And those counterpunches were significant in both knockdowns. The reason why this is important is because Lewis Crocker's strategic approach would have meant that Paddy would probably not have been prepared for this tactic. If you look at the first Lewis Crocker fight, you would assume that Crocker would have tried to take the center of the ring, would have put on more pressure, maybe would have punched more to the body, maybe have used the jab more. But you would not have thought that Lewis Crocker would have implemented a fighting strategy that would have been predicated on movement. So this was a very smart adjustment that paid dividends. And here's some questions to think about, or here's a question to ponder. Should Paddy look to adjust his own strategy if they have a third fight? Because clearly in the first fight, Paddy was moving. He was moving and he was using the jab effectively. But in the second fight, he took the center ring. So what should Paddy's approach be if there is a third fight? So let's talk about Billy Nelson. I think you have to give Billy Nelson a lot of respect because this fight shows that he understands how to identify and implement adjustments. Because instead of doubling down on the wrong tactics, he effectively went back to the drawing board. Here's an important point. A boxing trainer can make a positive or a negative impact on a fight. And boxing trainers not only create strategy, they build environments. Let me repeat that. Boxing trainers not only create strategy, they build environments. Lewis Crocker changed his fight tactics, and this changed the fight. To understand the importance of trainers and building environments, you only have to look at the great Emmanuel Stewart. He created the environment for Lennox Lewis to be undisputed heavyweight champion. He also created the boxing environment for Vladimir Klitschko to reign for what I believe was like 10 years. And Billy created the boxing environment to create that performance. Let's not forget that even though Lewis Crocker won the first fight on disqualification, he was taking a beating in that fight. He was losing rounds and he was taking a lot of punishment. So this strategic difference created a totally different fight. And with that, there's some questions to think about. For example, how much credit should trainers get compared to the fighters themselves? You know, of course, we have to give Lewis Crocker amazing credit, but how much credit should we also give Billy Nelson? Because like I said, not only was he the one that was responsible for the strategy, but he's also the one that created the boxing environment. And do we now consider Billy Nelson to be one of the top trainers in the UK? And additionally, if there's a third fight, can Paddy's team match these kinds of adjustments? Or can they make adjustments that will create a significantly different outcome? So what are the big money fights? Or are there big money fights? Well, Lewis Crocker versus Conor Benn, I think potentially is a big money fight. Both individuals are big punchers. Both have good marketability. Conor has massive general British appeal, but Lewis Crocker has that massive popularity in Ireland. So this could be a fight that could have cultural significance and economic significance. From Paddy's perspective, I think he needs to rebuild. There's a lot going in his favor. For example, he has a great trainer in Andy Lee, and there is a boxing environment that could cultivate some major success. And I guess that there's some questions to think about here. And one of the questions is, who would you favor, Conor Benn or Lewis Crocker, in a fight? Would it be a good fight? And do you think this fight would capture mainstream attention across Britain and Ireland? And then additionally, what path should Paddy take to rebuild his momentum? Because he clearly has some fantastic potential. So I think there's some key statements here. One of them is that Lewis Crocker versus Conor Benn could be a fight that sells itself. Additionally to this, Paddy's setback isn't the end of his career. It could be the beginning of a new chapter. And what's important to remember, and one of the biggest lessons from this fight, is that the right trainer and the right environment can truly transform a career.